Good evening. Welcome to the September 2020 meeting of the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California. This actually begins our 46th season of providing programs and interesting knowledge of our vast history in the US. We know that there have been many accomplishments by Chinese Americans over the years, over the centuries actually. And one of the most well-known marvels has been the construction of the first Transcontinental Railroad. Last year, 2019, we celebrated the 150th anniversary of the completion of that railroad. At the time, it was lauded as one of the greatest construction and engineering projects of the century. And we have a couple of experts to share with us a little bit more about the process that went into this and the role and the involvement of Chinese in it. We're honored to have a couple of scholars with us tonight. One is Gordon Chang. He's the Oliver Palmer Professor in Humanities and a Professor of History at the History Department of Stanford University. And he's also a Senior Associate Vice Provost for undergraduate education. He's written much on the history of US-China relations and Asian American history. Oh, by the way, he's been on the faculty since 1990. In 2019, he published Ghosts of Gold Mountain, the epic story of the Chinese who built the Transcontinental Railroad, published by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, and co-edited The Chinese and the Iron Road, building the Transcontinental, which was published by the Stanford University Press. So we're honored to have Dr. Gordon Chang with us. But let me quickly also introduce our second speaker, and they'll just segue into each other. William Gao is a former Chinese Historical Society board member. Glad to see you, Will. And he's been vice president of the Historical Society as well. He co-produced a documentary that the Historical Society created back about more than 10 years ago, Revisiting East Adams with Jenny Cho. And he also served as the project director for the Historical Society's Chinatown Remembered project. Will holds a PhD in ethnic studies from UC Berkeley, and he currently serves as a lecturer at Stanford University, where he teaches courses in Asian American studies, and history. He's a contributing author to the book, The Chinese and the Iron Road, which both Gordon and Will talk more about. So without further ado, please, Dr. Chang, Gordon, please take it away.
Thanks, Gene. Thank you, Historical Society, for inviting me. I'm pleased to be with you remotely. As you can see, well, you can't see, I put this on the background here. This is, I'm calling from Northern California. I wish I could be with you in person. It's really much more exciting, and also for me as a speaker to be able to see and be connected to a live audience, but we can only do what we can do right now in the crisis. I only have about 10 minutes. I was only given about 10 minutes. The time will go quickly. And I just want to share with you an overview. And then so we'll have lots of time for discussion and questions afterwards. I'm going to share my screen with you to show a few slides. You know, the Golden Gate Bridge was considered a great marvel of engineering and construction in the 1930s when it was built. But perhaps, as Gene said, perhaps the greatest construction project, certainly in the United States, maybe even rivaling that in the world to the Suez Canal, was the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, which was completed in 1869. And it made the United States whole. Before the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, it took 6 to 8 weeks to get from New York to San Francisco. And it was a perilous route. You could go overland, you could go down by ship to Panama and walk across Panama and come up by ship on the other side, or go all the way around the southern tip of Latin America. 6 to 8 weeks it would take you, and many people died along the way. Or you go overland, you go out to Omaha, Nebraska, and then you walk the rest of the way from Omaha to California. It was even though California was a state in 1850, the country was really divided literally politically because of the Civil War, but also geographically. After this Transcontinental Railroad was completed, it took 6 to 8 days to get from one coast to the other coast. And so that had a transformative influence on culture, on politics, on the geopolitics of the country, and the movement of people back and forth, east and west, west and east. Now, how did this marvel get completed? The western portion of the Transcontinental ran from roughly Salt Lake City to Sacramento. And that was built almost entirely by Chinese labor. And we don't appreciate it today, but 90% of the construction labor on that route was Chinese. And it was really quite astounding, and even observers of the time saluted the Chinese effort. But over time, they were often left out of the picture, neglected, or pushed out of the picture entirely. Now, this is the railroad history is foundational for Chinese America. It is part of our history. More Chinese worked on the railroad than probably any other occupation well up into the late 19th or early 20th century. Up to 20,000 Chinese labored on the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, I start off with a slide to try to grab your attention. This is Stanford University. And when I began the project some years ago, I had a discussion with a friend of mine about the railroad project. And he said, he asked his mom, do you know anything about the Transcontinental Railroad? And she said, she was a laundry woman. They lived down in Los Angeles. And she said, yeah, you know why the roofs of Stanford University are colored red? And he said, no, Mom, why are they colored red? And she said, because they're stained with the blood of Chinese railroad workers. And he was floored. And he told me that story, and I was floored. And this was part of the lore that circulates among Chinese Americans. Now, to contrast that, if you take a tour, a student-led tour on campus, you might hear this story, which I actually heard when I took a little tour around campus last year. And the tour guide leader said, very proudly, you know why Stanford University's roofs are red? And no one really had an answer. And he said, because Jane Stanford, the wife of Leland Stanford, wanted to be sure that her son, Leland Stanford Jr., who had died tragically at the age of 16, that he could see his university from high above in heaven and when he looked down. So those were two, it's really quite astounding contrast in these two stories of how the university is understood and how the railroad itself is also understood. Now, the railroad, and this is also understood, this very popular circulated photo, many of you have seen this. This is the Shaking of East and West, as it's titled, is maybe the most famous photograph from the 19th century. And it purports to show the conclusion of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. But as many people point out, many Chinese Americans point out, that there are no Chinese in this photo. And so all these guys, and you can tell most of them are not workers, they're dressed too well to be workers, and they're saluting and celebrating all of this. And it's understood, many people say, look, the Chinese are deliberately pushed out of the frame. They're not in the picture, literally and figuratively. So just like in history, the Chinese are not there. Now, when I started this project, in fact, I saw this picture and really studied it carefully. And in fact, I think there is a Chinese man right there. But his back to us, he's not facing the camera. His clothes are all tattered, it's thread-worn and patched up. He's got a worker's hat on, and he's trudging around in the dust here, really not that into the hoopla. Now, that's the way much of the history of the railroad has been given to us. The Chinese are marginal, perhaps even forgotten to us to today. Now, in fact, the Chinese were instrumental in constructing the railroad from California to Utah, and made along the way 4 guys enormously wealthy. And again, they're the ones who are usually cited as responsible for the railroad: Leland Stanford, As you can see here is a biography of him. He's a war governor, railroad builder, as if he built the railroad, and founder of Stanford University. And over here you have the big four, including Charles Crocker, Collis Huntington, and Mark Hopkins. And Huntington is the name that you guys down in Southern California should know well, because Huntington is all over the place, from Huntington Beach to the Huntington Library. But all that wealth, came from the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, there's another picture here, which also illustrates this erasure of history, or this distortion of history. And here you see this large painting up in Sacramento with Leland Stanford in the center, and Chinese literally at their feet, and other workers, and a gathering of luminaries who come to celebrate the great Leland Stanford. Now, this picture, it really is, in fact, based upon this photograph. And this photograph, you can see the composition of this painting was based upon this photograph. But here in the photograph, you can see the Chinese workers literally laying the last rail, right here and right here. These workers, 50 years later, may have been these guys who were brought out. But this, just to being able to give this little interpretation to you, took us, in the Railroad Workers Project at Stanford, which I helped lead, took us 8 years to uncover. And what we wanted to do, and what I've tried to do in the book Ghosts of Gold Mountain, was to present a history of the lived experience of the Chinese, to recover their work experience, to try to reconstruct what it was like to live, work, and die on the railroad of these up to 20,000 workers. At their high point, maybe 12,000 Chinese at any one point were working on the railroad. Up to 2,000, up to 1,200, or maybe even more died in the construction of the railroad. But these figures, this knowledge is not, you won't find in most textbooks, or many textbooks. So Will's going to talk a bit about this. This is a fundamental part of Western American history, US history, because of the significance of the Transcontinental Railroad. Without the Chinese, the railroad would not have been finished. And also, very importantly, the foundation for what we would call Chinese America. The Chinese railroad workers, after they completed their work and on the railroad that they helped construct, went all around the country. So Chinatowns, Chinese communities in Arizona, in Texas, in Chicago, in New York, all sprung up after the Transcontinental Railroad. And many of those places, Chinese railroad workers went to open up shops, restaurants, and to also work on railroad lines themselves. So the Transcontinental Railroad was transformative for the country and for the Chinese American community. Well, I wish I could talk a lot about the experiences and share with you, and maybe when we can in the question and answer period. I hope that you get to look at the two books, which really go into the substance of this history much more than I can in this short period of time. One of the things we did was just to even go back and look at what newspapers at the time were saying about the Chinese. It's not that they were neglected or slighted at the time, but many observers, such as this, you can see in this article here, recognized the central significance of the Chinese in the construction of the railroad. I'll just leave it with here to show you, this was a famous picture of the Chinese building one of the trestles here. These are all Chinese here. You can tell by their hats. With a magnifying glass, you can look over here and see hundreds of Chinese breaking down the hill, putting in, put rock and gravel to build up the embankments here. There are Chinese all over here. And no one really looked at this until we did with magnifying glass to look at even the evidence that we did have before. Now, just think about it. Here is one of the most astounding moments in railroad history is to get the railroad through the Sierra Nevada. Here it is in the middle of winter, Chinese with their sun hats again, Chinese coming from southern China, semi-tropical, and here they are finding themselves building a railroad through the Sierra Nevada winter. I'll stop here. Hopefully we can get to more specific questions, and I can go on and talk to you about some of the other evidence that we found and some of the experiences that we were able to reconstruct. But I'll turn it over to Will now, and Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Gordon. I think you gotta unshare your screen so that I can share mine.
Oops. No, I don't want to do that. Okay. Okay, well.
Yes, I'm good. All right. So it's a pleasure to be here at the Chinese Historical Society. As Jean mentioned, I'm a longtime member, former board member, former vice president, and this is certainly different from the last time I presented to the society, from when we met in the auditorium at Castlear. But it's a pleasure to be here virtually, and to be able to speak a little bit about my role in this project. So I am the author of one of the chapters in the book that Gordon Chang edited, The Chinese and the Iron Road. And I'm going to spend in the next 10 minutes or so a little bit of time telling you about what this chapter is about. Okay, so tonight really quickly what I'll do is I'll spend a real brief time going over the chapter. I'll talk really briefly about changing representations of Chinese immigrant laborers in US textbooks. And then finally, I'll say a few words about why the Chinese railroad worker became the dominant representation of Chinese immigrant labor in these textbooks. Okay, so for my chapter in this book, what I did was I examined 119 high school history textbooks published between the 1850s and the 1960s. This included both the physical collection at Stanford's Cubberley Library, but also digital collections on Google Books and Hoppe Trust Archive. In this process, I asked a few overarching research questions. I wanted to know, when did US history textbooks begin to mention Chinese immigrants? When Chinese immigrants were mentioned, did these textbooks give examples of Chinese labor? And to what extent did representations of Chinese immigrant labor change over the 100-year period that I was looking at? Now, going into this project, I assumed one of two things. Either I wouldn't find anything, there'd be no representations of Chinese laborers whatsoever, or if I did, then perhaps maybe I would see Chinese laborers begin to pop up around the 1870s, right? When you had the beginning of this kind of nationalizing of anti-Chinese sentiments, as you had in the West, groups like the Working Men's Party of California pushing for Chinese exclusion, and the slow nationalization of this kind of anti-Chinese movement towards the East Coast. And I thought that, you know, if I was going to find something, I would find it in this period. Well, after looking at these textbooks, what I actually found was that Chinese immigrant laborers became a significant part of US history textbooks only after the 1882 Exclusion Act, and that when these representations first pop up in the 1880s, it's not actually Chinese railroad workers specifically, but a whole multitude of different people or professions that are mentioned. And the railroad worker doesn't become the dominant representation of Chinese laborers until the first decade of the 20th century. So we've got Chinese immigrants appearing in textbooks for quite a long time, but Chinese railroad workers only becoming dominant in the period after the turn of the century. Okay, so how do these representations change over time? So the first representations that I was able to find were from the 1850s and 60s. And what most of these representations of Chinese laborers or Chinese immigrants seemed to show was that they tended to represent these immigrants as part of like a cosmopolitan atmosphere in the California Gold Rush. So we've got two excerpts here. The first one is from Augusta Berard's School History of the United States, which was published in 1855 and then republished in 1867. We have here one line. This is a description of San Francisco. The city was soon thronged with people of all nations. Even the grave Chinamen now walked its streets and introduced into California the peculiar dress, dwellings, and customs of the Celestial Empire. Around the same period, Benson Lossing, in his Pictorial History of the United States, published in 58 and then again in 66, wrote, "Around Cape Horn, across the Isthmus of Panama, and over the great central plains of the continent, men went by hundreds, and far and wide in California the precious metal was found. From Europe and South America, hundreds flocked thither, and the Chinese came also by scores from Asia to dig gold." So these are just two of the types of examples that we see in the 1850s and 1860s. Now, what's surprising, I thought that the 1870s would show a flourishing of representations about Chinese immigrant labor. But what I found was a significant decrease in the number of textbooks that actually included mention of Chinese laborers in the 1870s. So textbooks by Joseph Derry, Joseph Johnson, John Ridpath, all completely ignore Chinese labor in their editions in the 1870s. Not only that, but that textbook which I just showed you, Vincent Lossing, actually removes his section on Chinese immigrants for his textbook in the 1870s. So there's this kind of suspicious lack of representation in this period. In the 1880s and 1890s, we see Chinese laborers popping up, this time often represented as occupying multiple professions. So here from Horace Scudder's A History of the United States of America, these have helped to build railroads, to work the mines, and to do many kinds of household labor, but they have rarely become citizens. From Robert Howison's 1892 textbook, the Chinese made themselves useful and efficient as workers on railroads, in mines, in factories, in market gardening, in laundries, and in domestic service. And here from Mary Thalheimer's An Eclectic History of the United States, they cross the Pacific Ocean in large companies under the direction of contractors and find employment in the mines, in factories, in market gardening, and domestic service. So we can see here, as Chinese laborers are reintroduced to textbooks in the 1880s and 90s, that the railroad worker isn't the sole representation, but this slowly changes. So by the turn of the century, the textbooks that I looked at increasingly used only the Chinese railroad worker as a stand-in for all Chinese immigrant laborers in the western part of the United States. So, for example, Adams and Trent, A History of the United States, 1903. With the construction of the Pacific Railroad, large numbers of Chinese laborers had been induced to come to the Pacific coast. Edward Eggleston, during the time when the Pacific Railroads were building and afterwards, many Chinese laborers came to this country. So you'll see that in these two examples, right, we've got this solidification around the image of the railroad worker around the turn of the century as being the sole representation of Chinese immigrant labor. So why did this happen, right? We can see that there's this trend. So I'm going to posit one supposition of mine that might account for this. I would argue that the reason that the Chinese the Chinese railroad worker becomes the predominant figure representing all Chinese immigrant labor around the turn of the century and kind of stays in that role throughout the 20th century is because of the cultural ambiguity that the Chinese railroad worker represents. So what do I mean by this? Obviously, the railroad itself in the late 19th and early 20th century had a kind of like a dichotomous type of representation. On the one hand, the railroad represented progress, modernity, manifest destiny. But then on the other hand, railroads for many of the white working class represented corporate greed and exploitation. So you've got these two kind of split representations of the railroad. And I would argue that these two split representations of the railroad then embody themselves in the Chinese laborer, allowing in the Chinese railroad worker, allowing the railroad worker to become the predominant symbol over the course of the 20th century, as it's a symbol that can both stand in for different groups and the types of desires they have in retelling of the nation's past. So we see this kind of expressly done in two ways. So we see that there's a split in this period in that sometimes Chinese railroad workers are referred to as immigrants, and when they're referred to as immigrants, they often kind of link to this idea of progress and modernity. But at the same time, we see textbooks that refer to Chinese as, quote, coolies. And when they're referred to as coolies, they often represent the type of corporate greed or exploitation or threat of low-wage labor that many white workers felt Chinese immigrants embodied in this period. And so what I would say is that the Chinese railroad worker makes his appearance, becomes the dominant figure at the turn of the century because of this ambiguity. But the suspicious thing about this is, right, if we look at this, it's around the turn of the century when this happens. And this is also around the time in which Chinese exclusion is made permanent. So why is it that the Chinese railroad worker becomes the dominant representation at the same time in which the nation's laws have excluded Chinese Americans ostensibly forever? Well, what I would say is happening is that by the turn of the century, when these textbooks are writing about Chinese railroad workers, they're actually using this kind of the symbolism of the Chinese railroad worker to stand in for their fears about European immigrants from southern Europe. So what I argue in my chapter is that until 1924, the figure of the Chinese railroad worker was able to embody two things: both the hopes and the fears about non-European immigrants, especially those from Eastern or Southern Europe, and that the ambiguity of this figure is what allowed for this. So I'm going to give you just one last example here, and then I'll close. This is from David Muzzey's textbook in American history. Now, Muzzey is actually quite interesting because he is perhaps the most prolific textbook author of the 20th century. Certainly between the 1910s and the 1960s, his book is the best-selling textbook in the United States. Perhaps even some of you might have had an edition of the Muzzey textbook in your time in school, depending on when you went to high school. Now, what's interesting is we can kind of see this ambiguity represented specifically within Muzzey's textbook. So I'll read you this passage here. Between 1850 and 1860, the Chinese immigrants to our shores increased from 10,000 to 40,000. The work on the western end of the Union Pacific, that's a mistake, but the Western Union Pacific Railroad attracted tens of thousands more in the next decade. As these Chinese laborers lived on a few cents a day and were content with dirty quarters and poor food, they were a menace to the American labor of the Pacific coast, who demanded $4 a day and roast beef. Mobs in California and Oregon organized to run out of town the Chinese coolies, in spite of the fact that our government, by the Burlingame Treaty of 1868, had guaranteed the Chinese visiting our shores protection in trade, religion, and free travel. And so we can see, even in this one paragraph here, this one paragraph by Muzzey, there's this kind of dichotomy in terms of the way in which the Chinese railroad worker was represented. So in conclusion, I'll conclude here by saying that, if you were to actually trace, and you can read a little bit more about this in my chapter, but if you continue to trace the representation of Chinese laborers, you'll see that this ambiguity allows for one or the other of these kind of like sides of the figure of the Chinese railroad to become prominent at different times. So after the 1924 Immigration Act, Chinese tend to be represented as coolies, quote unquote. And then after the 1960s, or by the 1960s with the 1965 Immigration Act, you begin to have Chinese represented more as immigrants. So that's my excerpt. I should share with you that we have an offer for everyone who's here on the Zoom tonight. If those of you who are interested in buying the book that Gordon Chang and Shelley Fisher-Fishkin have edited, you can buy it directly from Stanford University Press for 20% off. If you use the code ChangFishkin20, so if you write that down, ChangFishkin20, you can get 20% off by buying it directly from the publisher. All right, with that, I will stop my presentation. And I believe what we're doing next is we are going to transition to questions from the audience. We have about 30 minutes here for Q&A. So if you have a question, what we'd like you to do is to look down. Don't use the chat box. Use the Q&A question at the bottom of your screen. Felicia is going to curate those and then ask them to us verbally. So type your questions into the chat, and Felicia will ask us questions, which Gordon or myself can type. Felicia, do we have a question?
Yes, so this question was actually before anyone talked. So it's from Brent Bonta. And Brent says, was there a Chinese worker connection to the construction of the AT and SF railway in New Mexico in the 1980s?
1890s. Yeah, Atchison, Topeka, Santa Fe Railroad is what we know it as. Good question, which opens up a whole range of questions about what happened to the Chinese after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. Many people assumed that the Chinese railroad workers were simply let go. In fact, some people talk about how abused the Chinese railroad workers were, that they had contributed their labor and then were just tossed out into the desert. But we know what we did when we went back and looked in the newspapers of the 1870 and the 1870s, and we found articles that describe Chinese railroad workers, many of them described as veterans of the Transcontinental Railroad, traveling all around the country to work on railroad lines, local railroad lines, down in Texas, Arizona, but also way out in Long Island, Alabama, Arkansas, Tennessee. What was astounding to us is that hundreds, if not thousands of Chinese continue to work on railroads around the United States in the after 1869, well up into the 20th century. Many continue to work for the Union Pacific Railroad, maintaining the railroad, the Transcontinental Railroad, and they lived and died as workers on the railroad. But they also worked for other lines all around the country. Now, this came to a surprise, but maybe it shouldn't be so surprising because people certainly assumed, oh, you're going to find Chinese railroad workers. Well, they were just on the Transcontinental Railroad. But the digital revolution has opened up to us the possibility of consulting local newspapers all around the country. These limited run newspapers were a treasure trove of information. They'd be little articles, long articles from Cincinnati, from Missouri, about the Chinese who were traveling to those areas of the country to work on local construction projects, and many of them local railroads. Now, on the railroad, Atchison, Topeka, the Santa Fe Railroad itself in New Mexico, I suspect there probably were, because the Chinese railroad workers, despite the fact they were abused and insulted and demeaned at the time, afterwards, as Will pointed out, at the time, many people around the country valorized, honored the Chinese railroad workers. You can see from the newspaper articles, because they saw the Chinese railroad workers as the veteran, experienced railroad workers. They had experience in laying the roadbed, in handling explosives, in building trestles, and their expertise was valued. Thus, they were considered to be desirable workers and brought all around the country. And in many instances, and I saw these newspaper articles, some of the articles actually complained. They said, we thought the Chinese railroad workers were going to be cheap, but they were not. They negotiated and had very high wages. They knew their value and were not as cheap as some had subsequently thought they were. So we know of them going to different places. Now, somewhere, I think it was in New Mexico, I forget which line. I think it's in one of the books. We should mention Chinese on the Iron Road, but the other book is The Ghosts of Gold Mountain, which I have to say is the Chinese on the Iron Road is a collection of 20 essays, wonderful essays, one of which was Will's. The Chinese and the Ghosts of Gold Mountain is written in my voice to give a narrative story, account of the railroad workers' story, like from beginning to end, as opposed to scholarly essays on various important aspects of their experience. The two books complement each other. But in one of the books, I forget which essay, we talk about evidence of a archaeologist, forensic archaeologist, who found a small little cemetery, graveyard of Chinese railroad workers in New Mexico. And these remains were dug up and studied. And it's a very tough story to read, but they found that these railroad workers died because they can look at their bone structure and so forth. They had tough lives. their bones and were distorted because of the kind of work they did. Many of them had broken bones, and some of them had evidence of being shot. So this was the kind of evidence that we had to kind of rely on. And I see it as another question about diaries. We had, to this day, have never found a single document written by a Chinese railroad worker, let alone a diary. We don't find it. We haven't found a letter. We haven't found anything. We scoured all over southern China, but to this day, not a single written document left behind by a Chinese railroad worker. So we had to use imaginative and creative ways to try to think about, try to recover what their lived experience might have been like. And I can talk more about that in a moment, but maybe I'll stop there talking about the first question by Brent.
Okay, so we have another question from anonymous attendee. Please contrast the US versus Canada Transcontinental Railroad worker issues and treatment.
Another great question. Again, many people don't know that Chinese helped construct the western portion of the Trans-Canadian Railroad. 10 to 15,000 Chinese also went up there to work on the rail line in the 1880s and 1890s. Chinese also went down to Mexico. They actually were all around the world. You can find Chinese railroad workers. I discovered evidence of Chinese railroad workers in Africa in the 1870s, 1880s. They were in Peru and Panama in the 1850s and 1860s. So the Chinese railroad worker experience is a global experience, not just in North America. But the Chinese were the mainstay of the Canadian Pacific construction effort, which was as bad or perhaps even worse than what they experienced in the United States. The terrain was treacherous, terrible, because of the Canadian, they had to get through the Canadian Rockies. It was a different sort of terrain. In the United States, the most difficult terrain was to get through the granite cliffs of the Sierra, the solid granite mountains, which required chiseling and explosives and tunneling, some of which took years to get through some of these mountains. The Canadian Pacific was very, very steep terrain through the Canadian Rockies, but the rock was different and much more unstable. So there were many avalanches and tragic accidents along the way. Now, interestingly, is that there is more documentation of the Chinese-Canadian railroad experience than there is of the US experience. So a little bit, we drew a little bit from the Canadian-Chinese experience to sort of make an analogy between what the Chinese railroad workers faced in the US. Now, the people were very much the same. They came from the same regions of China. They were Southern Chinese, all from the Pearl River Delta and near Hong Kong. Many of them came from similar villages. They may have been countrymen, clansmen. So we can know something about the culture of the Chinese railroad experience in the United States by looking at other evidence, including from Southern China, what the home villages were like, what the work culture was like in China, what the culture was like, what they ate, what they did in their leisure time. We can know not necessarily for what they did up in Truckee, but we can know what they did in Southern China or in Canada and surmise that that's also what they were experiencing in the Sierra. The other point I would just say about comparing the US and Canadian experience is there is, in Canada, much more official acknowledgement and honoring of the Chinese railroad workers as contributors to Canadian history than there is in the United States. You can find major monuments and tributes to the Chinese in Canada that you cannot find in the United States. Now, why is that so? Well, we can have some discussion about the different issues of race and reconciliation with the historical past. Will pointed out how Chinese were written out of textbooks over the years for many different reasons. Part of American history is it's a great man. His story of history that we have in the United States is a nationalist one. It's a sort of a celebratory of the national accomplishment. And to do that, the alien, the immigrant, the minority has to be written out of the narrative. But it's really, as we'll use the term manifest destiny, this triumph of the American nation, which is considered in certainly monochromatic ways, writes out minorities. Canadian history is maybe written in a different way.
We're curious, Gordon, just kind of jumping on that point. Like,
Yeah.
You just mentioned that Canada has this kind of like longer history of recognizing the railroad workers. Do you know when that started to happen? Like, when did they start to kind of like really appreciate?
Well, I think fairly early on. I don't know if I can give you a date. Maybe, in the 1920s, 1930s, people began to collect documentation, archives on Chinese America. And then in the past 20 years, the Canadian federal government, the national government, as well as provincial governments have made a much effort in trying to really recognize, using our vocabulary, the multicultural history of Canada, including First Nation people, Canada now being bilingual, French and English. These are big changes that were in Canadian, whereas before it really was an Anglo-dominant, Anglo-supremacist sort of country. But the past 20 years, they've really gone out to take the initiative in trying to find this diverse history. So in British Columbia, was it national? They contributed something like, devoted $1 million to a research project up there to help recover British Columbia Chinese Canadian history. We don't have that here.
Okay, we have a question from Linda Bentz saying, thank you, Dr. Gao and Dr. Chang for your talks. Could you please tell us more about the lives of the Chinese railroad workers when they lived in China before they came to America? Did they have construction skills when they came to the West?
Another good question. The Chinese came from a fairly small region of southern China. For those who know Chinese American history, they came mainly from Toisan and Hoiping, or Kaiping and Taishan, which are part of 5 counties in a sort of portion of southern China near Hong Kong and Macau. That area was unique. It was had long been populated, but fairly modest in wealth. It was almost all agricultural, although it did have local handicraft industries, including pottery and gunpowder factories later on. Now, almost all the work in that area, the economy, was agricultural. So farming, fishing, some trading that took place. So the Chinese who came to the United States were all predominantly young men between the ages of 15 and 25. There were some who were a bit older, even some who were younger. Very, very few, there were some, but very few women. Some did come over, and many in very poor, terrible circumstances as slave girls, as prostitutes, and some came over as wives of merchants. But we had no evidence of Chinese women working on the Transcontinental Railroad, although there is some suggestion that Chinese women did work on some of the trunk lines. They're listed in some of the payroll records. Chinese female, they put an F afterward, and worked as on some of these lines, but not on the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, the problem with recovering the history of the Transcontinental Railroad, among other things, I mentioned the lack of textual evidence, is that the railroad company itself did not keep good records. They didn't have good HR. So that's why we don't even know the numbers very accurately. Now, one of the reasons of that is that the railroad, the Central Pacific Railroad, contracted with the Charles Crocker's company, the labor contracting company, to construct the railroad line. And they in turn contracted with Chinese labor contractors who did the actual hiring of many of the workers. So they worked in labor gangs, 20 to 40 in a team, if you will. And they were often headed by a headman, as they called, and they were paid by the railroad company or the construction company. So there was these permutations of relationships, these different relationships, and the records were not well kept by the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, most of these workers had never worked as wage laborers. They worked as farmers in southern China. But the southern Chinese culture was very strong, very developed, and we had a lot of fun learning about the southern Chinese culture, local culture, including folk songs, village practices, family practices, spiritual beliefs, which included a very, very strong belief in needing to respect those who had passed before, the dead. And the year is marked by almost just every month, or I mean, sometimes actually 3 weeks, events to honor various populations of those who had passed before, those who were closer in kind, those who were further, those who had relatives, those who didn't have relatives. So even today we still have aspects of this culture with the Qingming Festival, even with the Dragon Boat Festival, New Year's, all circle around family and honoring those who had passed. And so this is the kind of the culture that they brought over to the United States. And in the US at the time, very few Americans had any sense or any sensitivity of these traditions. And so the Chinese seemed to be very odd to them. But we could look at some of these observations made by the newspapers of these celebrations, these events, the behavior of the Chinese. And today we can look back and see that, oh, they did these things because of their spiritual or cosmological beliefs.
Okay, we have
Maybe I'll just give you one example. I didn't want to be too general here. Some of you may know in 1867, 3,000 of these Chinese railroad workers, way up near Donner Summit, around Donner Summit, the peak of the Sierra, 3,000 of them in June, late June, went on strike. It was an astounding act. It was the largest strike, labor strike in US history to that time, and for many, many years afterwards. This strike is hardly acknowledged, if at all, in labor history books, even by progressive labor historians. They just don't even know about this labor strike. This labor strike was recorded at the time by the Sacramento newspapers, and they were observing how was it that these 3,000 Chinese all at one time, stretched out over 10, 15 miles of the construction route, in one moment, put down their tools and refused to go to work. We don't know anything about the leaders. We don't know anything about, we know a little bit about the demands. The strike was eventually broken after a week when food was cut off to them and they were sort of starved out. But we always wondered, why did the Chinese take this action on June 22nd or something of this sort? And I thought about it, and I went back and thought about their cosmology, that is their worldview. And I realized that they made the strike decision on the day of the summer solstice, the longest day of the year. And the Chinese have a lunar calendar. They follow the year because of the phases of the moon. And the summer solstice is a very auspicious day. So I think that they took their dramatic action in line with their cosmological belief of when they would have the strongest male strength of the year.
Okay, there's a question from Emmy Kim asking, do you know more about how Chinese were erased from our history books and pictures, or impacts of this on people's understanding of how this group contributed to our country?
Will, you want to address that?
Yes, sure. I mean, one of the things that was interesting from looking at these textbooks, more than 100 of them published over the course of 100 years, was the fact that on the one hand, they were ever present, right? Like the Chinese railroad workers or Chinese immigrants are visible throughout this, but then the way in which they're represented isn't in any type of holistic fashion, as you saw, right? There are these snippets, one line or two lines. And I think that certainly like for Asian Americans and for folks that, you know, students that are learning about this, the inability to see yourself in history textbooks does have a profound way on can have a profound impact on the way in which you look at yourself, the way in which you kind of see your relationship to the world. I don't know. I would suspect that the textbooks have gotten a little bit better, but having said that, I would think that the problem really is more of a problem with learning history from textbooks to begin with. Like, I don't really have much faith in the textbook history that they're ever going to really fix up, or that you really even, if it's even possible to like truly represent the multitudes of history that we have in this nation. So yeah, I guess I would say that the Chinese are ever present, that the representations though don't really live up to that complexity, and this can cause issues in terms of the way in which people see themselves in relationship to the United States.
Okay, there's another question from Tianjin Montoya. Did either of you find in your respective research instances of meaningful organizing or acts of solidarity between Chinese railroad workers and indigenous/native or Black workers?
Intriguing question, and we were very curious about that too. There were some Black workers in the West and all on the Transcontinental Railroad, mainly on the eastern portion. These were freed people who came to work on the railroad after the Civil War. Some came all the way out to California, and there's evidence of freed people in California, very few in number, but intriguing. We studied the census records and some of the local records of Truckee up near Lake Tahoe, and found on the record in 1870, there were 4 barbers in Truckee listed on the census. All 4 of them are recorded as mulattoes. So really interesting. And we could have gone there and try to find out who these folks were. Now for Native people, there's also, in one of the essays in the Chinese and the Iron Road, an essay written by a colleague who did study this precise question. And other archaeologists did look into this, and they found meaningful evidence of meaningful interaction between Chinese and Native peoples. Some of them tragic. Native peoples didn't want any foreigners in their territory, but other evidence of cooperation and interaction, including trading of items, Chinese made goods they found among Native American encampments, and also evidence that the Chinese got food and foodstuffs from Native peoples. There are family stories, a couple of family stories where Chinese, young Chinese were actually brought into tribes and brought up for many years within the tribe. And so part of their ancestry, it was Chinese, but they had lived among Native people. I think we talk a little bit about that too in some of the work. I want to, if you don't mind, Felicia, I'm going to just address one question here about other evidence of their work in Northern California, up in Fort Bragg or wine caves and there. Well, one of the challenges before is to really do much more work in trying to understand the Chinese contributions to construction all over Northern California, including the wine caves in Napa, including retaining walls. I didn't show you a picture of this immense retaining wall that still stands up near Donner Summit, called the China Wall, where Chinese masons constructed this monumental wall to hold up the railroad line. And these kind of China walls are found all over Northern California. They're not made with any mortar, but just with fitted stone. So there's a lot more to do out there. I hope that some of you will take up the task. Last question is, how many died? We think about 1,200.
So I think on that note, we're coming to a conclusion here. I'm going to turn it over to Eugene Moy again, who's going to say a few final words. Gene, are you there?
Yes. Okay, I'm fine. Sorry about that. My ancient computer takes a little while to get started. But anyway, thank you, Gordon, and thank you, Will, for a real enlightening presentation here. I saw that there were many questions that will maybe some of us will try and get to some of it also. But certainly, you know, there are going to be many opportunities for learning about the history of Chinese American engagement in the American economy. And we're going to hopefully continue the discussion, have further explorations. But I want to share with everyone that our next program will be on October 7th, Wednesday also, probably a little bit earlier in the afternoon to accommodate work schedules. But our speaker will be Tamara Vennett Shelton, professor of history at Claremont McConaughey College. And her topic will be about Chinese herb doctors. How many of you have been to a Chinese herb doctor, or you've gone to an herb store? She's done a tremendous amount of research and produced a book called Herbs and Roots, a history of Chinese doctors in the American medical marketplace. So should be a very interesting presentation, interesting program. So we look forward to your joining us in future programs. And again, you can always email us. There will be there should be a closing slide there that gives you the Historical Society website and email address. So feel free to send questions our way. And so thank you very much for joining us tonight on this journey of learning about Chinese American history. Thank you and have a good evening.